We are officially in our third installation of our Nature Connects Us webinar series. And today's topic is flooding and fires and the impacts of extreme weather. So this is a really exciting topic. We're going to take 15 minutes to join a special guest that we have with us today. His name is Brad Carl. He's one of our newest employees. I had the pleasure of hiring Brad in December last year, and he is our external affairs and climate specialist. So Brad is our first full-time external affairs employee here in Oklahoma. He's very much focused on government relations, and he brings a really amazing background to our and expertise to our chapter in helping us further conservation and addressing issues such as climate change. I won't give away all the exciting details, but you might recognize his face and you might recognize his voice, especially if you are a Tulsa area resident. So with no further ado, I'd like to turn this over to Brad. He will take 15 minutes to provide his presentation, and then after that, we will open it up for the Q&A session. You can chat us your question via the chat button down at the bottom, or you can click the Q&A button and submit a question that way as well. So you have two options. So without further ado, Brad, it's all you.
All right. Thank you, Katie. And thank you all for joining us on this chat about the kind of the extreme weather and climate impacts we have here in Oklahoma as we delve into the flooding and fires aspect of what we deal with here in the Sooner State. So Katie, if you want to go ahead and advance to the next slide, she's kind of in control of all that. So we're kind of working as a team here. So quick background on me, as Katie said, you may recognize me if you're from the Tulsa area. It's because I used to be a meteorologist up there at Fox 23 News, was there for a little over 3 years, spent 8 years in broadcast meteorology, hopping from Billings, Montana to Fayetteville, Arkansas, spent the last 3 or so years in Tulsa, and then recently came down the turnpike to Oklahoma City, where I am now, working for the Nature Conservancy. During that time, though, when I got a chance to do broadcast for those 8 years, talked everything about severe weather, certainly a very common topic in Oklahoma and Arkansas too. Flooding, sustainability, climate issues, you named it. We covered a lot of that during my time. So my background in that is fairly extensive, and I really had a chance to kind of delve into a lot of that, in particular in Oklahoma, just to see just how wild and crazy that really is. And that certainly all of you who have been here for longer than I have know just how wild our weather can get here in Oklahoma. Next slide. So as we kind of delve into this topic a little bit, we definitely see a lot of extremes here in Oklahoma when it comes to weather. One aspect of that we certainly see, at least when it wants to, we can get a lot in the way of heavy rainfall. And we saw a lot of that, particularly in the eastern portion of the state last spring. Katie, if you want to go ahead and click play on that video there. It was in Muskogee last spring. I believe this was in May. And this is right off of Highway 69 as you're coming into Muskogee, and you have kind of the whole travel and fuel plaza there just totally underwater. And then that's all farmland out there as you see that kind of back in the distance, but it's all totally underwater. I mean, this was right along the Arkansas River, and it looked a whole lot more like a lake than a river. That whole area around there was just totally underwater, with Highway 69 barely kind of riding above that water. So it really was something to behold there. Of course, Muskogee has 3 rivers that come together, so they're just kind of at a confluence of all that water coming together. And so we're dealing with a lot in the way of heavy rainfall. Unfortunately, Muskogee was one of the hardest hit spots. We certainly saw widespread historic flooding last spring, a lot of that in eastern Oklahoma. And something that might be interesting to you, and we'll delve into this here in a second a little bit more, but the number of days with heavy rainfall are actually increasing in Oklahoma and also across the country, though at varying rates. We can actually delve into that a little bit more. Next slide. So I've got a couple slides here from our partners over at Climate Central, and they put together a lot of graphics and data talking about climate and weather impacts kind of all together, and do it in a really great kind of presentation way, just sort of makes it easier to digest. And so with this, what you're looking at here is in Oklahoma City, the days that there have been and years with 1 inch or more precipitation. So what you're seeing on each of those dots is representing a year of which during that year, how many days in that year did you have 1 inch or more of precipitation in the course of a day? And you see you got kind of a scatter plot, things kind of all sort out some kind of below that line, some above that line. But the line going from 1970 all the way to 2019 is up, going from about a week or so. In 1970, we had about 7 days where we'd have an inch or more of rainfall in a given day in Oklahoma City. And notice going through 2019, that has about doubled. That's fairly significant. Notice there's still a lot of variety from the top to the bottom. So you're still having years that are not necessarily on that line, but when averaged together, we're seeing more of that, at least an inch or more. Go ahead into the next slide. Now looking at Tulsa, and you notice here that we've changed the instead of being 1 inch of rainfall, it's 2 inches. And that's nothing weird with the data or anything, but as you go farther east in Oklahoma, you have more rainfall. In fact, a lot more rainfall the farther east you go. Even between Oklahoma City and Tulsa, Oklahoma City averages about 36, 37 inches of rainfall per year. In Tulsa, it's closer to about 41. And the 40 inches was the cutoff for this data. So they go from, I think, 1 inch for Oklahoma City, which is defined as significant, to Tulsa, since they're over 40 inches, 2 inches is defined as significance. That's just kind of a little data kind of dive into that. And you notice it's not quite as much of a change in Tulsa when we're looking at 2 days with 2 inches or more of rainfall. In 1970, about 2 or so days of that, to now between about 3 and 4. There's something interesting according to the data, though, that Climate Central went through, and they went through data going all the way back to 1950 with some 242 different weather stations across the country, mostly in metro areas where we have established climate areas where we study that over a longer period of time and get good data that way. 79% of those, so 191 different stations, recorded from 1950 to 2019 and increased in the number of days with heavy rainfall. So it gives you an idea that this is something that not just Oklahoma is dealing with, but other areas around the country. Next slide. So 2019, of course, was particularly significant. We saw a lot of flooding, particularly around Tulsa, Muskogee, areas like that, just a lot of water coming on down. Some of the worst flooding Tulsa had seen since about 1986, since the Memorial Day floods there. It was also very expensive too. Flooding, although we talk about tornadoes and big hail and things like that, that's kind of seen as the really crazy stuff in Oklahoma. Flooding actually is the most expensive when it comes to any kind of disasters. It's just a very expensive disaster to deal with. In 2019, it was the 5th consecutive year, this is talking about the US now, where we had 10 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disaster events in the US. So 5 years in a row of that. That gets awful expensive. Just for Oklahoma alone in 2019, there was upwards of around $2 billion in flooding. And Katie, if you want to click play on that video there, this is along the Arkansas River in Tulsa, and you can see just how high the water level is there. For those of you who have been around Tulsa, you know that the Arkansas River many times throughout the year just kind of flows at a light trickle. It's not known for being a raging river throughout a good chunk of the year. But that particular spring, I mean, it was just over its banks like crazy, flooded the gathering place, flooded a lot of areas down there, and caused a lot of erosion too. So that was certainly a huge issue. Next slide. But how about when we have the kind of things go the other way, when we see the pendulum swing and go toward the drier side, or sometimes very, very dry side? We deal with intensified droughts, and that Oklahoma is also no stranger to either. So when we have warmer temperatures around, we definitely increase evaporation. And of particular interest when we have wildfires and things like that, our main wildfire season tends to be in the late part of the winter and the early part of the spring before we have our fuel. So our grasses and whatnot, our prairie lands, you think about them in the winter, they're brown and don't have a whole lot of color to them. They go dormant during the winter months, and then they start to come back and start to kind of get more of that greenness to them as we go on into the spring. But just before that point, we tend to get a lot of wind. It tends to be our driest point in the year through about February and the early to mid part of March before we start to get into more of the spring rains and that color and just those grasses start to kind of come back alive again and come out of that dormancy. So in that time, that's kind of our main fire season, and that's when we've seen some of these really big fires occur. What you're looking here on the screen is the Ray fire, with I'm sure a lot of you in central Oklahoma remember from just a couple of years ago. And I believe what you're looking at, so of course you got the big fire here, and then just to the northwest of that, there's a little cluster, and I believe that's the town of Visai. And so you get an idea of just how large this fire was looking from space. This was from one of the European space satellites. And so you get an idea just how big and devastating that fire was. Certainly caused a lot of problems for farmers, cattle, really, really devastating for a lot of folks there. Of course, as dry spells occur, one of the new issues we're dealing with now is just the idea that climate change exacerbates them. It can make our droughts last longer or be more prolonged or more intense. And that's one of the things that's in terms of what we understand about climate change and what we don't. That's one of the things that's actually the best understood, with severe weather kind of being at the farther end of the spectrum of we don't understand as much the connection of what could be linked to climate change and what couldn't be. So in particular, because we deal with droughts here already in Oklahoma, this is something we really have to watch for. Also something to keep in mind too, when we're dealing with precipitation falling as rain, particularly in the winter, our plants are dormant. Once again, they kind of go and become kind of that brown and kind of gross looking color. They can't absorb that moisture when they're in that dormant state. In fact, a lot of them dry out, not just a matter of days, but a matter of hours. So the problem is we have things falling as rain versus snow. Rain, it gets absorbed into the soil for a short amount of time, and then it kind of goes away. Snow, you have that, and it kind of gradually bleeds into the soil, bleeds into our river sheds, and can stick around a little bit longer, especially as we go through a drier season. Don't have as much snow, then we have more problems with drought, and certainly with farmers and agriculture needing to use more of that water later. Next slide. So dealing with intensified droughts, also very expensive. An OSU study highlighted that Oklahoma suffered $2 billion in losses from 2011 and 2012 drought. You see here on the Oklahoma Drought Monitor in December of 2012, just how much the state is covered in exceptional drought, much of western and kind of north central and northwestern Oklahoma, with much of the rest of the state in kind of that extreme drought. So we were really, really, really dry, and that gets very expensive. $2 billion is nothing to sneeze at. Problem is also too, as farmers and agriculture have to use more water in order to kind of take care of their crops and whatnot, they're going into things like the Oklahoma aquifer, so deep below the soil, where you have this aquifer that's basically accumulated over thousands, not millions of years. And so as we're using more and more of that, it's getting dried up and not getting replenished. And so that's a particular concern is as we deal with droughts like this and we use up aquifers, that's going to cause potential problems for agriculture going forward if we run out of that kind of spare water to use. It's deep, deep underneath the earth for us, and was one of the things highlighted in the 2018 National Climate Assessment for our region. Next slide. So once again, things do get expensive with this too. So looking at this, this is once again from Climate Central, and these are numbers adjusted for inflation too. The 1980s and 1990s, we had upwards of around 10 separate billion-dollar weather and climate disasters. That jumped to closer to around 20 through the 2000s, and has now gone to above 30 such, almost close to around 40 in the 2010 era. So as we're seeing more and more of this, this does tend to get very expensive for Oklahoma as we have to deal with this more and more. So resiliency and how we adapt to this really becomes very key. Next slide. Something else to keep in mind too, as we talk about climate change and how this all kind of meshes all together, important thing to keep in mind is we deal with the extremes here in Oklahoma all the time. That's nothing new. We get heavy rain, we get a lot of droughts. That's not going to change. But as we deal with climate change along with this too, basically what that does is load the dice and make those extremes either more frequent or long lasting. And that's why it's important that we be resilient as much as we can possibly be as we kind of see the rules of the game get changed just a little bit with that weighted dice kind of analogy. Next slide. So what's important too to keep in mind is, although we tell you about those things with the extremes and how we deal with them, what's also really important is what are those big solutions? What are we going to do about that? How can we adapt to this? And there are three separate things that we with the Nature Conservancy are either advocating for or asking for you to help out with. So for flooding in particular, we are advocating for, at least in a lot of ways, nature-based solutions. That does not necessarily mean that we're not going to use dams, we're not going to use levees in the future. We're just saying, hey, we can also use nature to augment that, to help make our resilience that much more. A study from TNC highlights that for every dollar spent on buying floodplains, on using that for flood resiliency, and using that to basically help nature absorb a lot more of that water when it does flood, that could save the U.S. $5 in terms of future damages. So as they say, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. This is absolutely true in this realm with at least some floodplains, which is why TNC is really highlighting this as a good investment opportunity and a good return on investment to make sure that what we do invest in terms of natural infrastructure, make sure we don't have to pay out more of that kind of later. There's actually a cool success story. I'll just kind of highlight this real quick with my own near where I grew up. This is the town next to where I grew up in Ording, Washington. They had dealt with flooding over and over and over and over again, had a particularly bad one in 2009. After that, they said, that's it. We want to look into something different. The Nature Conservancy worked with the city of Ording and worked with the state of Washington to help basically look into natural climate solutions. And so they did that by moving some of those levees back. They were able to help to kind of widen that flood channel a little bit. For structures that were near the river, they were able to move them back or buy them out and kind of move people back a little bit. When they had the next big flood that came along in 2014, even though it was at the same rate as the really devastating one in 2009, where they had to evacuate at least a good chunk of the town, in 2014, it didn't cause any damage. Things were okay because of that investment that they did. And also, as an extra bonus, helped to provide more habitat for the at-risk salmon that we're using the Puyallup River as well. So kind of a cool success story there. And this is being replicated in spots across the country too, as they're looking into the benefits of this. Congress has also directed the Army Corps of Engineers to consider nature-based flood control because of seeing that return on investment and how good it's been. Next slide. Oops, one back. I know I'm going just a little bit over on time, almost done here. So solution here as far as dealing with fires though, and this might seem a little, whoops, there's my timer goes off. And this might seem a little counterintuitive. You think, well, why are we burning things? We're supposed to be into nature, supposed to preserve all that. Well, the plains and forests and everything, they do naturally burn. A lot of that was started by lightning strikes kind of before we became a little bit more entrenched in things. And so it's important to make sure, at least in control, that these places do burn from time to time. That can help prevent some bigger, larger out of control burns. You see here Jeremy Tubbs out at our nickel preserve over near Tahlequah, and he's using that drip torch there to go ahead and set a controlled burn. This is something we do extensively across Oklahoma. We conduct and partner with agencies to do controlled burns on an average of 50,000 acres across the state per year. That is no small task. That is no small amount of land. So that's actually very cool. And we actually recently signed a wildfire agreement with the Chickasaw Nation and the BIA to help them better be able to do a lot of this controlled burning, which is really key to make sure you don't have big out of control burns that can put people and livestock and larger areas at risk. Next slide. Whoops. And the last thing we ask you to do. So this is something we had a chance to talk with our congressional reps about this last week, actually, very successfully. We talked to 6 of our 7 members of our congressional delegation, so basically everyone except for 1 senator. This is something that the Nature Conservancy is really very much in support of. It's called the Great American Outdoors Act. What this would do is to ensure full and permanent funding of the Land and Water Conservation Act and Restore Our Parks Act. You might be saying, well, I don't know what any of that does. I'm going to tell you what about it. So basically what it does is allow for more investment and ensure more investment in our parks, in the Forest Service, in a lot of our national parks that have maintenance backlog, protecting parks, protecting public lands, and also helping to invest in some of those solutions I just told you about with the natural-based flood control aspects and using nature to help basically with a lot of that flood control, as well as also with some of that wildfire, at least the big wildfire prevention by having more in the way of controlled burns. Since 1965, Oklahoma has received upwards of $60 million from this and funded more than 1,500 park improvement projects from the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which is part of this act. Now, this is funded by offshore oil and gas revenues and not by tax dollars. So we see this not only as a good thing for nature and a good thing to help make sure that we are more resilient and can adapt to things like crazy flooding and large wildfires in Oklahoma, which we already deal with, but also as a way is, especially right now dealing with COVID-19, to help make sure economically that we're in a good place too. A lot of these spots that need protection are in more rural areas, and we understand just how important it is that as we try to get our way through this situation, we got to make sure that economically that Oklahoma is well taken care of too, and also helps provide and sustain jobs in a lot of these areas. And so we see this as kind of a win-win in both those aspects, and got a lot of positive support from our congressional delegation that are very interested in this act. Currently, right now in the Senate, At some point, we expect it to be brought over into the U.S. House, and hopefully at some point be one of the outgoing stimulus projects, bills that would be coming on through. We expect this to be attached to that. So that's kind of the game plan where we're at right now. So next slide. So what can you do about this? Well, we are asking you to help make a stand for nature. So this is kind of in honor of Earth Day, but also kind of recognizing the role that nature can play in all this, as well as the good economic benefit this has too, as we try to recover from COVID-19. We are urging you to help take this pledge to tell our congressional reps that it's not just TNC that wants this. It's also something that Oklahomans want as well. I think this is a really important investment in terms of what we're doing. So would highly recommend you go to this link here after we're done chatting here, nature.org/Earth Day, where you can take that pledge, where we'll basically send an email along to your congressional rep to let them know that, hey, I do support this. I think this is a really important investment that we're making. So all that being said, I really hope that you kind of look into that a little bit more. If you want more information, we are happy to provide it for you too. And I went a little bit over, hopefully Katie forgives me. And we can go ahead and kind of have a little more of a question and answer session about anything I've covered today. If you just want to complain about the weather, hey, I know how that works too. So we can go ahead and talk about the weather you do, don't like, that works. So whatever you want to talk about, that's kind of what the rest of the session is for, is for a quick Q&A session for you to basically ask about whatever you want, whether it be about what we just chatted about, weather, climate-wise, anything else we're doing policy-wise, have at it.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. That was very informative. And I do absolutely forgive you for going over on time. It's no big deal. It's great information. And, this is still some of this information we're all still digesting and just trying to get our minds wrapped around it. So we really appreciate your narratives and as well as your analogies to help us get a gist of a good understanding of everything. So for everyone, please, at the bottom of your screens, you will see there's a chat button and a Q&A button. You can pick one of those and text us your questions for Brad, and he will answer them here for you live. So this is as good as it gets for right now. We can't meet in person, so this virtual Q&A session will do, and we're really excited to hear your questions. So we do have one already from John Seldenrust. He says, thank you, Brad. I am curious on how challenging it is to trend the frequency or severity of weather given the variability and macro multi-year weather patterns that can occur. In other words, how hard is it to measure current weather events relative to past weather events? Ooh, that's a good question. Have at it, Brad. What you got?
It is a good question. And the way I would kind of measure that is, it is difficult to be able to say, well, how does 2019 compare to, say, 1973? Well, we can go back and look at the data in terms of almanacs and look in terms of how much rainfall fell, what was the temperature like, what was the humidity like, and whatnot. And those are kind of some of our best gauges in terms of any kind of changes we're seeing over time or how severe one year was from one year to the next. So, for example, if we're talking about, well, how bad was the flooding one year, versus another, well, we can look at either, say, a specific weather station that's been in the same spot. That's important too. Some weather stations have moved a little bit. A lot of that happened a long time ago, but the idea is ones that have been consistently in the same spot, we can say, okay, well, how does 2019 stack up to how it was in, say, 1973? So we can go and look and say, all right, here's how much rainfall we had during that spring. We can cut the data in terms of whatever range or anything that we want. And can look and say, okay, well, in 1973, we had this amount of rainfall, but man, in 2019, we had a lot more. And so that gives us kind of a better idea when we're actually looking at hard data-wise, how much, changes we're looking at, how much in terms of severity that we're looking at. And of course, it's beyond just, we can't just look at, Tulsa. Tulsa's not a good gauge, for example, for the whole rest of the state. Good news is that we have a whole network of things through the Oklahoma Mesonet. In terms of weather stations dotted all across the state, dozens and dozens of them, really, really good to give us good climate data going back at least to the 90s. So we have more recent stuff in there, but even back further than that in a lot of our larger populous centers like Muskogee, like Poteau, like Tulsa, Oklahoma City, Weatherford, we have more long-lasting data. And by looking at that, we can get an idea of any kind of trends that go on beyond just one little spot, but also looking back a lot farther. There's also a lot of good data when it comes to river flows. So if we're trying to look at flooding, you know, maybe Tulsa didn't get rained on, but a lot happened upstream. Well, we can go back and look at the historic flows on those rivers to say, well, how bad was the flooding on that one year versus another? And that helps to give us an idea of what we're dealing with from one year to the next. As far as the severe weather aspect, which I think you kind of delved into a little bit, John, that's a lot hard to measure. You know, when we're looking at, well, how big was the hail one year from one year to another? Yes, we have reports of that, but a lot of that's very isolated. And if anything, when it comes to climate change and kind of extreme weather, we have less of a connection there. We don't have a great understanding of the mechanics that are involved in there, whether, you know, tornadoes are worse now than they were back then. We also have better radar data. So when we start delving into a lot of the severe aspects, and by severe, I'm talking about tornadoes, big hail, and wind, not so much the rainfall. Rainfall, we have a fairly good understanding of. But tornadoes especially, there's a lot of question marks in terms of what the impact of that could be from climate change and kind of our changing baseline there. But there's a lot of ongoing research in terms of how those impacts could kind of play out. Very heavy amount of research into that right now.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. Some of that went over my head, but I trust you, Brad. No, that's very interesting and intriguing on all of that. And I have heard multiple times people making comments about tornadoes related to climate change and whatnot. So that was really interesting. So thanks for filling us in on it. We've got a few more questions that are rolling in here. Let's see. One from Christopher Hill. He says, I will certainly make a stand for nature. Thank you, Christopher. We appreciate your help there. Every little bit helps. And just for a side note, everyone, on that stand for nature, one of the other things that we do is while that is a national pledge, we go in and we will export the Oklahoma pledgers and we send those to our congressional leaders and say, here are the folks within here are the constituents in your district who are supporting this work as well. So, and then the rest of his question, let me actually ask his question for you right quick, is, are there any other actions we as individuals can take to address these impacts of extreme weather in helpful ways?
Is this sorry, whose question was this?
This is from Christopher Hill.
Oh, okay, I'm seeing it now. Okay. I mean, a lot of this, especially when it comes to the cost aspect, I mean, as I mentioned, like flooding is some of the most expensive that we deal with in the entire country. Whether that be for other states dealing with, say, inland flooding from hurricanes, things like that, which occasionally we can get remnants of hurricanes that can come up here too. So we also occasionally have to deal with that. If any of you remember what was Tropical Storm Bill that came wandering up into southern Oklahoma and dumped upwards of a foot of rain in like less than 24 hours for some spots of south central Oklahoma. It was really bad. So we can get impacted from hurricanes occasionally. But as far as the big impacts from that, I mean, a lot of that's just, I think the best we can do is a lot of that resiliency. Whether that be, you know, making sure that we have river sheds that can handle high amounts of water over longer periods of time. Like what we talked about with the Army Corps of Engineers, them utilizing more of those natural climate solutions to help augment the systems that they already have, the dams and the levees that they already kind of help to maintain. So a lot of it's kind of, you know, can you completely protect your own home, say, for example, from being hit by a tornado? No. But can you build a storm shelter to help make sure that you're more protected? Yeah. And so I think a lot of that's just kind of is going to be about how can you at least best prepare for a worst case scenario, with the idea of when it does happen, if it does happen, that you're at least in the best possible shape you otherwise could be. We don't have the technology to steer flooding rains or steer tornadoes around where we don't want them to be. That's not in the cards. But the best thing we can do is kind of help to adapt ourselves to that, to be as resilient and kind of strong in that way as possible. And by building up a lot of our natural infrastructure, especially when it comes to flooding, especially when it comes to fires, things like that, that's going to help us to be better prepared regardless of which way the pendulum swings on either the heavy rain or the ultra dry side, which we know we deal with somewhat regularly in Oklahoma.
Super. Thank you, Brad. And I'm going to, if you don't mind, add a little bit to that. Christopher, a few other, and for those else who are interested in that answer to that question, I will expand upon that and also encourage you to help improve the narrative of climate change by having positive productive conversations, whether it's with your neighbors, with your family, with your friends, with elected officials, and talking about the important role of nature. This summer, we will actually be launching a Let's Talk Climate campaign, and there will be tools and resources as a part of that. Brad has been working feverishly on a number of focus groups in regards to this campaign, and Christopher, you're actually going to be getting an invitation very soon. OCLA is a part of one of those focus groups, and so we're actually crafting that content right now. And so you will be hearing from us very soon on that. One other thing I'll add to that right quick is if you own land, so you own an acreage, you can implement best management practices to improve the stewardship, conservation focused decision-making practices on your land. So if you do own land, you could partner with your local prescribed burn association to implement prescribed controlled burns. You can contact your local county conservation district to discuss more about financial and technical resources available to you to conduct the burns and or do any cedar clearings or other invasive species eradication on your property. Those are some other things to consider. And something else you can do is encourage others. So if you know folks who do own land, encourage them to contact their local county conservation district, encourage them to practice best management practices. One other really good resource for best management practices is the Okies for Monarchs website. It's okiesformonarchs.org/rangelands. That link will take you to a long list of best management practices. While it's focused on pollinators, essentially it's benefiting all wildlife, and it's benefiting all the native plants and species throughout Oklahoma, as well as the soil and water quality. So those best management practices are really good. To utilize that URL again is okiesformonarchs.org/rangelands. So Brad, yeah, fill in on here for me.
One other thing I wanted to just kind of piggyback on that is, so of course there's solutions that, you know, we can work with the Corps of Engineers and whatnot too, but there's also actually a piece of legislation that we're interested in that's in this session right now. That's still active and still could potentially get past this session about passing a statewide flood plan. We don't currently have one right now. That's something we're interested in helping to support because we think that, you know, dealing with flooding, that kind of thing is obviously hugely impactful, especially after last year. And so we would ideally like to be able to see something like that get passed and can help maybe work in some of those natural climate solutions that would help us be better prepared for more flooding in the future should that happen.
Fantastic. Awesome. Thank you for expanding upon that. All right, we have some more questions here. Let me get down here right quick. Rebecca Renfro is asking, how can a city ask and receive assistance from TNC for city planning as your example? What kind of situations can and does TNC help cities in this respect?
That's a very good question. And I don't think that's something we've really delved into a whole lot here in Oklahoma just yet. Of course, I'm kind of our first external affairs full-time employee. So this is kind of a new venue for us, or at least kind of new endeavor that we're going in. But, you know, seeing success stories like the one I shared about in Western Washington, and there's certainly opportunity for connection on that. And so one of the things we're working to do is to help better establish ourselves as being kind of that area of expertise, or at least having people on our staff who could help provide expertise to cities, to our state government in terms of, hey, these are other solutions that are in the toolbox that you don't even know about yet. So as we kind of help to work with our partners, work with cities more, work with local governments more, work with tribes more, we'd like to be able to talk about a lot more of those solutions. So that's definitely in the cards for us going forward as we kind of build up our external affairs presence within the state.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll add on to that as well, that there's been a variety of instances here in Oklahoma where we essentially kind of act as a consultant, Rebecca, to cities. We don't necessarily have manpower to provide field support by any means, but we can connect you to resources, best management practices guides, and other case studies and scenarios to help develop that planning for you. We also do provide input. So for example, Oklahoma City currently is gathering input on a sustainability plan. And so we provide our expertise on plans like that as well. We do want to contribute our expertise where we can, but manpower is definitely limited in regards to being able to do more than just that. But what I would recommend, Rebecca, is to email us. You can email me personally, or you can email any of us, any contacts if you have any. If not, khawk@tnc.org is my email address, and I can forward it on to the appropriate person. khawk, khawk @tnc.org. Feel free to reach out anytime. Looks like we've got another question here. Looks from Rochelle. Rochelle is asking, when you discuss natural ways to control flooding, what role do the dams have today, and has it changed over time? Great question, Rochelle.
That's an excellent question. You know, obviously, many of our lakes, most of our lakes in Oklahoma are from the result of having dams. For example, actually, there was a very critical dam that we had on the Arkansas River in Tulsa, still do, Keystone Dam. And those were built after a series of very bad floods that we had back in the 60s and 70s. And they said, okay, we got to better control this watershed a little bit more. Thankfully, that dam, which although is older, held up pretty well and prevented more devastating flooding from happening to Tulsa and farther downstream. So those dams do still play a very critical role in making sure that we don't have out of control flooding and whatnot. At the same time, we also have to respect that when you build a dam, you're also interrupting, you know, a lot of the natural flow of wildlife, things like that. This has been highlighted in the West, where you're interrupting, say, for example, salmon returning to their spawning streams and things like that. And so when we're building dams, it's something that really has to be kept in mind of, especially new ones, to make sure that you're not having a negative impact on wildlife. So when we're looking into solutions for flooding and whatnot, the dams we have right now, they're great, but at the same time, we should also respect that there is a wildlife impact on that too, which could, you know, really impact a lot of fish populations, things like that. Certainly the land kind of around where those lakes would then build up, things like that. They have a part to play, but I also think that looking at natural climate solutions, you can still have a lot in the way of flood control, still have it be cost effective, and at the same time, if anything, maybe actually promote some of the habitat being restored as opposed to very severely interrupting it. So I think it's a very careful balancing act we have there to make sure that obviously that we as a people are protected from not if, but when we get heavy rains, when we have heavy flooding, but also making sure that we also respect the animals and wildlife and the importance of that and the role that plays too.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brad. We've got another one here from Nick, who is one of our awesome volunteers. Thank you for joining us, Nick. And his is also focused a bit on the same topic, but he's asking, how extensively can nature-based flood measures be applied? For example, do small-scale measures like they do in the Southwest work here, such as induced meandering, one-rock dams, etc.?
That's a good question. As far as I understand, a lot of these nature-based flood solutions, a lot of this is very new. This has only been coming around over the last, I'd say, 5, 10 plus years or so. So we're still learning a lot about what are really the most effective ways to deal with that. I can tell you there's a lot of good examples of cities starting to implement that, realizing how much of a return on investment there is with this, as opposed to building new infrastructure, just kind of letting the natural infrastructure do what it needs to do. As far as the specific ones in terms of induced meandering, I believe that's actually what happened in the Ording, Washington example. The Western Washington one is they had made the channel very straight, and so they said, well, why don't we instead let it go back to its natural course? And that was part of what helped to expand that floodplain to make sure it just didn't hit a kink there right up against that town. So I know things like that are being explored in terms of how extensive it can be. The Ording example is a pretty good one. Davenport, Iowa has been using this to a heavy example. A lot of spots along the Missouri River, which were devastated by flooding over the last couple of years, are now exploring a lot of these measures to see how extensive they could be. So it's an active area of research. That's maybe not the nice answer with the nice pretty bow on top that you want, but there's a lot of research and a lot of engagement around this in terms of how much that can be used for good. And that's something that we can follow up with you later on and show you more in terms of what is being done right now on that scale to hopefully be ramped up and save people from flooding, help out animals quite a bit and wildlife and kind of protect that while also making sure that floods aren't more expensive than they have to be.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you, Brad. Appreciate you expanding upon that for us. Okay, and Nick says thank you as well. So a little note, just a side note here right quick, everyone, if you were trying to access that okiesformonarchs.org rangelands webpage, we had some troubles with the website this morning. The GoDaddy is our host, and they had a server that was down, so it looks like not everything is rectified, and it might be a little difficult to access that page. However, I am going to put in the chat link here a direct link to the PDF that is, you can download a single file and have all that information at your fingertips. If you see any error codes on the Okies for Monarchs website, please note we are working on that and trying to get that resolved with our server. In the meantime, I'm looking right quick, and it looks like we have answered all the questions that have come in. Anything else you wanted to share before we wrap this up, Brad? This has been a really great and informative session, so we really appreciate you taking time to share your expertise with us. I will also add to everyone that please note we are planning another one of these with Brad in September to talk specifically about climate change and really kind of getting into the details about having conversations and a little bit more in depth specifically about climate change. So we'll look forward to that. But any closing thoughts or tidbits you want to share with us, Brad?
Well, I think it's just really important, as we're talking more about the issue of climate change too, we're really looking to help bring a lot of our partners on board. And so as we're working with, say, for example, the Oklahoma Department of Wildlife Conservation, they're interested in this topic, don't necessarily know as much how to approach it. And so what the Nature Conservancy does is we like to help bring people together. We like to kind of help form consensus. So we're offering ourselves as kind of that area of expertise, but also as a way to kind of help bring people together, saying this is an important topic. We think it's worthy of discussion. We think it's worthy of us talking about how we can better protect ourselves, better be resilient with this topic. So we're helping to kind of figure that out right now. And as we kind of get more and more feedback, and that also includes from you too, we'd love to hear more in terms of your thoughts on that, in terms of maybe where you live in the state, see more done, if there are concerns you have. The more feedback we get, the better. The idea is by later this summer into this fall, we're going to have a better idea of, what does it mean to talk more about climate change and adapting to these extremes in Oklahoma specifically, and understanding that it has to be very locally focused. I can't talk about how it is, in Miami or in San Francisco. That, it matters what's happening here and how do you talk about it here. So that's what we're really trying to kind of hammer out right now. And then by this fall, we're going to have these Let's Talk Climate sessions where we can actually go a little bit more into detail in terms of this is what people in Oklahoma really care about. This is what really interests them in this topic, and do it in a very bipartisan way too. And that's really, really important that we work with our legislature. We work with our congressional reps, a few of which we talked to have already looking into carbon sequestration and carbon capture technology and how Oklahoma can be a part of that, carbon crediting, all sorts of very cool solutions. That we want to be very solution oriented. So that's something we're definitely delving into a whole lot right now. It's certainly a lot of what I'm doing and looking forward to hosting those sessions and filling you more in as we get to that point into this fall.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm looking forward to it as well, Brad. We're real excited. We've got a lot of work that's going on behind the scenes to prepare ourselves getting ready for this campaign. So big thank you to everyone who joined us today, Nick and Rochelle and oh my goodness, who else asked questions? Christopher and John, Rachel, I believe. So for all of you who asked questions, thank you so much. And for everyone who also joined, Rebecca was another one of those who submitted a question. But and for those of you who attended today, big thank you. Right quick, we also, and a big thank you to you, Brad, before I continue to my exit screen. Thank you. We really appreciate it. This has been a very intriguing conversation. So we appreciate that. And so before we depart, we just want to remind you that our next webinar series is next Wednesday at noon with our very own Bison Bob to discuss bison, burns, and butterflies. If you haven't met Bob Hamilton before, he is quite the character and is a very fun and entertaining person to hear and learn from. He is the director of our Tallgrass Prairie Preserve, and we'll be discussing a variety of topics in regards to prescribed burns, but how it helps our native wildlife from bison to buffaloes. So join us for that. It is sure to be an entertaining session next Wednesday at noon. Until then, we hope everyone stays safe and healthy, and we look forward to seeing you again next week. Thanks for joining us again. Bye-bye.
See ya.